All right. Good afternoon. A final session on Kant, whenever this thing comes on. Is it working? Yeah, there it is. So, yeah, as you'll have seen, if you've looked at the syllabus recently, our class is sort of chopped into several units. The first of which is the longest one, the one that we're coming to an end now, on the state and the justification of the state. So today is the last of that. After this, we're going to go talk about justice and equality and things like that. So we have quite a bit to do. Before we start, this is where we left off last time, so you don't have to read that right now. Before we start, two quick things. So one is, as a result of us ending today our first long unit, on Tuesday next week that we'll have our first exam, which talks about all the stuff that we've done in that unit. So that's really from week 2. So after you wrote your short essay up until today, including today. I'll put on some notes onto Canvas today or tomorrow, probably today, giving you an explanation of the way the exam will look like, some sample questions, and a potential way of studying. Basically, the outline will be, there will be a number of, this will be similar if you've taken a class with me in the past, it'll be the same format, but basically there will be a number of multiple choice questions that sort of test your comprehension of the various authors that we've seen, and then there will be an essay question to which you will be required to, or expected to write a slightly longer text answer. Now, a couple of things about this. One is you can bring your notes and your readings and stuff with you. I'm not trying to, I don't care much about how well your short-term memory works. I'm caring about how well your comprehension part of your brain works. So you can bring those and use those. And I'll also, probably on Monday or something, I'll say on Canvas roughly what the topic of the essay question will be. So I might not give you exactly the essay question, but I'll tell you sort of what, maybe I'll give you the exact essay. I don't know. I have to think about it. I have a question in mind that I want to ask, and I have to wonder what the best way of doing this is to either hint or spell out. So that should allow you to prepare pretty well. Okay, that was 1. 2, if you remember the announcement from last time, and on Canvas, later today at 5, we have a guest speaker, Professor Husak, who's going to talk on drug policy. Title of the talk is, Why Has Our Drug Policy Changed So Little? I've seen a version of this talk in the past, I think, and it's pretty interesting. So if you're in this class, you're probably interested in the kind of stuff that would interest you in this talk as well. So I recommend it for that reason. Also, Professor Husak is probably one of the, if not the, sort of leading figure in philosophy that writes on things like drug policy and the extent of the criminal law, problems of overcriminalization, and so on. So that's, yeah, highly recommended. I'll be there. All right. Any questions before we go? I thought I saw a hand go up from the corner of my eye, but I'm not sure. No? Okay. So, Kant. Got a bunch to get through. What I want to do is I want to get through what we didn't finish last time, which is Kant's argument for why people can be coerced into the state of nature, out of the state of nature into civil society, or the rightful condition, as he calls it sometimes. And then we'll go on to what we were going to talk today, which was not as long as, not as much anyway, because I was anticipating going along, which is about Kant's views on disobedience. Reading questions were about it. So we stopped here last time. We saw Kant gives you 2 arguments for why you might be forced into the state of, into government, into life under government and under the law, and why life in the state of nature is unbearable conceptually. It might be perfectly fine in terms of your material, how pleasant it is. You might have a pillow to sleep on, right? There might be music being played through all the speakers all the time, whatever, right? It might be the nicest thing you can imagine. Still, right, he says there's something conceptually amiss. It's the highest form of injustice reigns there, he says. So One version, well, we talked a bunch about last time, had to do with appropriating, claiming external objects as yours or mine, right? So making a claim to something that was previously unowned. And Kant says that's the effect of a unilateral will, and that seems to infringe or limit upon other people's external freedom, and your unilateral will cannot legislate for others what their freedom is going to be like. That can only be done by uniting the wills of all, and guess what? When the wills of all are united, we're in the state. That's what the state does. So that's one argument. We saw that there might be some worries about this. The reading by Ripstein mentioned some counterexamples offered by Simmons, and talked about whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. Then there is a slightly different version of the argument that Ripstein develops, which really comes from, well, really one sentence in section 44. But it's sort of the standard argument that Kantians these days really go for. And in some ways it's more interesting, I think. So I want to go through that. So here's the section, right? So first, Kant says, when you claim a right in the state of nature, you thereby claim that others have an obligation. And then he has this weird sort of, looks like a bit of a magic trick where he says, well, you can only put others under an obligation if you can guarantee that you would respect your obligations. But it's not just your obligations, it's this universal rule of obligations. And so we can't really guarantee unilaterally that everyone will respect their obligations. And so nobody is required to respect their obligations. Something like that. And then why would we insist on the need for that kind of assurance? Well, the first version is Hobbes, right, that he gives. He says, look, you don't have to wait to find out whether the others are well disposed towards you. That's what he says earlier on. Then a couple sections later, in 44, he gives a slightly different argument. He says it's not experience from which we learn about their violence. Right? So it's not an empirical thing that he means. We don't have to wait. Like, that's the Hobbesian point, right? And Hobbes says, well, as a matter of fact, it'll turn out empirically that the state of nature is crappy. He says it's not an empirical matter for Kant. For Kant, it's all reason all the time, right? So we don't learn their malevolent tendency to attack one another before legislation that with power, the state, appears. It's not from experience that we learn that. However well-disposed law-abiding men may be, right? So however angelic and sweet and peaceful and fine the state of nature might turn out to be, as a matter of fact, imagine that we're super lucky and we live among the nicest people you've ever met, right? It still lies in the a priori rational idea of such a condition. So just the idea, right? I just can't speak for the idea. Of such a condition, one that's not rightful, state of nature, that before a lawful public condition is established, the state is established, individual human beings, peoples and states can never be secure against violence from one another, since, here it comes, right, each has its own right to do, emphasis, what seems right and good to it, and not be dependent upon another opinion about this. So this seems to depart, or so Ripstein says, from an idea about disagreement. Roughly the idea seems to be this, right? Like when we have a disagreement about what rights and obligations we have in a state of nature, here's how Locke describes the state of nature, you're judging your own case, right? So you get to choose. In the end of the day, which interpretation of justice goes, right? And Kant says, actually, that's true. You're in a state of nature, everyone has the right to do what seems right and good to you. Right? Who else are you going to rely on? Right? I think you've done me wrong. You think you've not done me wrong. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Okay, who am I going to go with ultimately? Right? I can go with my own yes or your no. Well, Kant says, in the end of the day, you don't. Like if you think really hard and good about it, maybe you ask advice and so, but ultimately in the end, right, you got to make up your own mind and go with it. But that's the problem in the state of nature, he thinks, right? That means in the state of nature, all we have is people acting on their own several private interpretations of justice. So we just have a bunch of judges in their own case running around, and that's not the same as a system of justice where we have presumably some type of public or impartial or some sort of general idea of justice that rules us all. Right? It's not the fact that, not like Locke says. Locke says, well, we're judges in our own case. Let's see what's the problem. Well, people are biased and a little selfish and so on, right? Some people are not so smart, other people, right? Whatever. No, says Kant, that's not the problem. The problem is, in the end of the day, even when you're really smart and you really de-bias yourself or whatever, right? It's just your opinion. And justice is supposed to be more than just your opinion. And if justice really is supposed to be more than just your opinion, and in the state of nature all we have are people's opinions, then you can't have justice in the state of nature. Right? No? All right, let me step by step. You're looking like I went too fast, Dominic. You surprised by how good I made Kant sound? I am.
Wonderful, yeah.
So, yeah. All right, here's an argument. It's in 2 steps, 2 parts, actually. So, just the old Kantian stuff, right? Necessarily to assert something that something is right or wrong is to assert that others are under an obligation to do it or not to do it, right? It's just part of the concept of right and wrong. Necessarily, for people to be under an obligation means that they can be justifiably forced to do it. Right? See, Kant says hindrance through hindrance argument, right? That's inside the idea of right that it allows force. So, therefore, to assert that something is right or wrong is to assert that others can be justifiably forced to do something. Probably necessarily too. Doesn't matter much, it's true, Kant thinks. Now, your judgment that something is wrong, right or wrong, is an expression of your unilateral will, right? It's just your opinion in that sense. But here it goes, like your unilateral will cannot really determine other people's enforceable obligations. We've seen that theme a couple of times in Kant, right? Here's a reason why. Remember, for Kant, all morality and all rights and stuff is universalizable, right? So it's reciprocal or symmetrical. Whatever, in Locke we've seen the same thing, right? Locke says our equality means that when you have a right, I must have that right too, at least in the state of nature. That's why we all have a right to punish, right? If anyone has a right to punish, then everyone has a right to punish. Since it's impossible that no one has a right to punish, then everyone, all of us must have it, right? Kant uses the same idea here, right? So if your unilateral will could do so, and determine other people's enforceable obligations, then everyone's unilateral will can do so, right? And so that's contradiction, because right can be only one thing. There's only one answer to what is right, but we have several 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 different unilateral wills, right? Now, we'll 6 billion unilateral wills if we don't live under government in this world, right? So now we have 6 billion versions of what our enforceable obligations are. Or maybe just in this room we have, what, about 15, 20? It can't be, right? It can be only one thing. So you cannot unilaterally settle what is right and wrong, says Kant. Now, by definition, necessarily there are only unilateral wills in the state of nature, because if they were tied together in this omnilateral will, we'd be out of the state of nature. That's the state. And so then it follows that in the state of nature, right and wrong cannot be settled. Can't be just one answer to what is right or what is wrong, what our obligations are, what our rights are. Because it's all subject to whoever you're talking to and what they think is right and good. Dominic. Something was brewing.
Yeah, so in Epstein, he pointed to the idea that Kant says that courts make decisions not because they're infallible, but because they have the public authorization to decide for everyone. So, to me, that's unilateral will. It's just like, the only difference is with that definition is, let's say you're the court, or you're the judge, we just authorize that you're unilateral will is what we need to will. There's still no unilateral will that can be.
Good.
It seems problematic.
Yeah, so the idea is the judge is only just a person too, and so the judge makes up an answer or arrives at an answer.
His definition, the way he lays it out, it seems to say that it's not much of a difference. We just agree that your unilateral will is unilaterally agree to, and that seems like we can get that in state of nature.
Right. Good, yeah. Or even if you could get that in the state of nature, right? Or the flip side of it would be, if that's all that the state does, then the state starts looking an awful lot like the state of nature.
Exactly. Right. It's like almost like what Locke would say. It's like kind of like worse, because if we have one person
Yeah, now he has a lot of power too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a really big one. So here's Kant's answer to that worry, for better or worse, right? So when the judge or the courts or whatever, it's nice that you said the courts the first time and not the judge, right?
Yeah.
So for Kant, there is a difference between the courts arriving at something and just a person who happens to be a judge at arriving at something. And the difference is when the person, I mean, of course, the courts are inhabited by people, right? But the verdicts of those people are binding upon us not because of the people they are, but because they're in function.
Yeah.
So they're in function. So when the person is speaking, it's in name of the courts, really, right? So the law is settled by the impartial, impersonal institution of the law and the courts through its agents who just take up. Now, so here it goes. Right? Think about the judge says you're now sentenced to 5 years in prison or something. You're found guilty of something. That means legally you lose your right to be free for 5 years. Right? But only if the judge does it under certain circumstances, right? Only if he's sitting on the bench wearing robes and a certain thing is going, right? If the judge in his night, like drunken stupor at night, calls you up and says, you're going to prison for 5 years, doesn't work, right? And the difference is, in one case, the night drunken judge is doing stuff. It's the same guy, right? Or girl, whatever. But he's doing it in his private capacity, just as a normal person. Whereas if he's sitting on or she's sitting on the bench wearing robes, then they're doing it out of their public or official capacity as an agent of the state. And so what Kant wants to say is that's the difference between, on the one case, it's his unilateral will. In the other case, we know it's something different that's being done. And so it's a different kind of verdict that's coming to you. It's the same contact. You have 5 years prison, right? And if you can make it happen, the effects will be the same for you. But qualitatively, there's a difference. In the one case, it's a unilateral will. In the other case, justice. Right? But why is it justice? Because it's happening by someone in their function as an agent of the state. And the state has this quality that the person doesn't have, which is the person is just another individual will. The state is an impartial public entity that, if things go well, apparently somehow bind all of our wills together and so gives us something more just to see. So that's going to be the... Now, most Lockeans think that sounds all well and good, but I'm still let me know when you can tell me how exactly this will transformation happens, right? There's something to be done in terms of the explanation here, but that is Kant's view, and it has its attractions, I think. But.
And then number 4 in this argument is one that strikes me as somewhat dubious, because it doesn't necessarily follow that your judgment is something, your judgment that somebody's ironic expression of unilateral will. Because you can still appeal to, since we have reason, and people, we like to think that people like appeal to these our ideas. I mean, you can still, your judgment of something right or wrong could be a judgment of something that is universal, rather than just a unilateral.
Right. Yeah, nothing in this argument depends on whether you get it right or not. Yeah. Right. So for Kant, you might be in a state of nature and you might live side by side with me, and I might be sort of Kant incarnate, and I see all the moral truths exactly with the analytic precision and et cetera, right? So I could apply the law, like the law of nature or whatever, or rights, and exactly as it ought to be done, and it would still lack the real quality, the true quality of justice, right? Which is because it's just me. Yeah. It's just me, Emmanuel. Yeah, and the difference is that in the end, what I'm doing is it's just like, remember, right? The background of this is that we start out naturally as free and equal beings, right? Free meaning we have the right to live by our own reason, and equal being, insofar as you can bind me, I can bind you in return, and vice versa. Right? Insofar as I can bind you, you can bind me. So the fact that the content of what I'm trying, my will, might be correct, doesn't really give me the authority, right? Because we still have this equality between each other. And so I might be the perfect reasoner, but we're still symmetrically located. And so it's just my opinion, and I'm trying to, when I say, here's the truth, you're going to live by it. Right? I'm going to say, well, my opinion is superior than yours, not just in terms of content, although we all believe that, but maybe Kant's is probably better than ours, right? But it's also superior in sort of standing, like who wins the day at the end, right? And Kant thinks, well, that second one, where we ask like which will wins the day, none of the unilateral wills could be it. Could be the one that wins the day, because they're all supposed to be equal, right? So we need something else, which is then the state, which binds together all of our wills symmetrically. So it is another will, but it's built up out of exactly all of our wills equally. And therefore, even though it's a separate will, it doesn't put any one of us above the other.
I don't know if this metaphor will be as applicable, but it almost seems like in a way it's like instead of everyone having their own anchor and saying, hey, I'm going to distribute justice to you, throw you down the river, everyone's got their ankle tied to the anchor. And so if you do justice to one person, it's all connected in a sense, like you're all bound by this. I don't know if that metaphor makes sense. That's kind of how it makes sense to me. Like you've all got yourself in a situation where, you know, if I pull the trigger, all the other triggers get pulled as well. So you can't just like, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, well, the key part for Kant would be that so every individual person, including that drunken judge, right, even though he has, when he's in function, the ability to tell us what our freedom will look like, minus 5 years, right? He too, or she too, will be subject to the law, right? So he or she only has that power because the law endows him or her as in virtue of a certain position with that. But also, if he or she oversteps other parts of the law, he'll be subjected to the law just like we are, right? And so that's going to maintain our equality within the state. So in that sense, even the judge who seems to be superior to us, or even the politician who gets to tell us what we do on a day-to-day basis, it's like tied to that anchor maybe in the same way, right? Like or the strings are equally long, even though they seem, right? Yeah, Ian?
So I'm trying to understand that I could be wrong. So what he's saying right here is there could be several right and wrongs based off each person's own perception or whatever of what right and wrong is. But we can.
If we're in the state of nature.
If we're in the state of
right.
nature, correct. But we cannot force somebody to do something if your obligations are not there. Because everybody's right, wrong, good, conflict.
Yeah. Right, and if there are no obligations, now we can sort of zip back through the argument, right? If there are no obligations, then there are no rights, right? And if there are no rights, then really there is no justice. And so now we're back into what seems, that's why he says the state of nature is devoid of justice. Even if we end up not killing each other, not stealing, whatever, then there's still, that thing is missing. Right? Yeah, good. All right. So this is the first half. Here's the, we'll go on. So, hold on. We ended here, right? So the state of nature, right and wrong, cannot be settled. There cannot be one thing that's right and wrong because we all have these different views about what our obligations are. So it goes on. Then justice requires that right and wrong can only be one thing. Then it follows there can be no justice in the state of nature, right? We just talked about this. Okay, well, if there can be no justice in the state of nature, then we can see how this goes on, how it's a further problem, or how it leads to the state. So he says justice can only be settled. This is now the positive argument, right? The first part was the negative argument against the state of nature. Now here comes the alternative. It can be settled, there can be one thing, if we can somehow manage to incorporate all of our wills equally and arrive at some sort of determinate one single answer. And we do that by this omnilateral will that is enforced, that's the state. Right? Condition with an omnilateral will, civil condition, the state, therefore justice can only exist in the state. And that's your argument for why this type of disagreement, the possibility of us having different points of view, or the fact that we have different points of view, leads Kant thinks to the moral necessity of the state. Right? It's not just that empirically it will be unsafe, not just that it's inconvenient, as Locke says. No, it's that justice requires it because you can't have it outside of the state. It's only possible conceptually even. Any questions so far? guess that's how. Look at Kant being very clear. All right. So just to emphasize, right? I personally think that this version of Kant is more interesting because it relies on a shared point between Hobbes, Kant, and Locke. Namely, it starts from the natural equality of people, right? The stuff about appropriation is not a shared point, right? So Hobbes thinks property is whatever the state creates. Locke thinks, no, you have fully fledged property rights in the state of nature. And Kant thinks it's only provisional rights, whatever the heck those things may be, right? But this is kind of interesting because now we set this aside, and I think Kant's remarks on property and appropriation are suspicious anyway. But this is more interesting because all three of them accept that people have this natural equality, that there's no one who's sort of naturally superior or more authoritative than others. There are no natural bosses. Right? If you accept that, Kant says, then you really have to go all the way with him to seeing that the state is necessary, morally speaking. So Ripstein, by the way, says that this is about indeterminacy and connects it to the judiciary. It's just about the indeterminacy of rights and so on, that there's some vagueness maybe about where your rights end and the others begin and so on. Maybe indeterminacy sure seems sufficient to get the thing going, but I think it's quite a general problem. It's more general than Ripstein seems to make it. Ripstein makes this difference between general rules and then their application. And general rules are indeterminate about how they ought to be applied, and so that's where the judiciary comes in. And so this is supposed to be an argument that only applies to the judiciary. And it fits nicely with the overall theme and layout and structure of the book, but I think it's hard to make sense. Anyway, take that for what it's worth. Even the general rules of justice have to be interpreted, and we can even disagree about those. So it seems to me a quite general problem, which, by the way, is good for Kant, right? And the more general this problem is, the more forceful or powerful it becomes for his theory. So trying to do Kant a favor here. Sure you'd appreciate it. All right, here's a couple of questions. So, key part of the argument, right? Very quickly, is something like this. In a state of nature, only unilateral judgments about right and wrong. Justice requires that right and wrong are settled. This is not the same as being settled, right? We just saw that. So therefore, there can be no justice in the state of nature. It's a very condensed version of what we just saw. So justice requires, right? Sense of required is at play here. Like, does it mean like it'd be better? There can be no justice without it being settled.
Is it just like a necessary condition?
For what, right? A necessary condition for?
For justice.
So.
For further to be any justice, you have to have an establishment of right and wrong.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Then. So. It has to be an establishment by whom? Like, by just like outside, we have to have an agreed one upon, like so.
Yeah.
Right. So one thing that you might say that is required just sort of like a theoretical demand, right? So that the theory of justice needs to be settled or univoke like one answer. So that seems fine, right? Yeah, I don't know. I find something fishy going on here with Kant, where it seems I'm not quite sure why we shouldn't just say justice has an answer. Don't kill people or something, right? Don't steal their stuff. And your actions can line up with his answer or can fail to line up with his answer. It's a very Lockean way of thinking about it, but Locke talks about right and wrong as a relation to a norm, like the actions stand in a certain relation of fit or not fit to the norm of right and wrong. And so that seems to be perfectly settled, right? Maybe some questions are left open by justice, but then that's also settled, that it's left open. I'm not sure exactly how we go from the idea that we'd like justice to have just one answer to the view that if we have different opinions about justice, then there is no justice really. It seems to be a problem for us, not a problem for justice. But Kant seems to think something different. I tried to make the strongest case I could a moment ago, but just wanted to register that you can have doubts about this. Here's a way of saying it, right? Kant says, in the state of nature we have just as several wills. I think you've done wrong. I don't think I've done wrong. Right? Who wins? Well, we both try to insist on our view, right? The Kantian wants to say, well, when we insist that we're the ones who are right and that the other one has to live by our standard, we're asserting that our will is superior than theirs, worth more authoritative or something. I'm not sure that that's what we're asserting at all, right? We're just asserting that we're right. It's true, right? And if we're asserting that we're right, we're not appealing to us having a kind of authority, but to the thing that we're referring to, justice having a kind of authority. Justice being the thing subject to which all of us are equally. Right? So sometimes I worry that there's some sleight of hand going on. Now, this is a big debate going on right now in the literature. If you want to see this stuff, Google public reason. You'll see a whole bunch of philosophers alive right now having exactly that type of fight. But anyway, this divides people, is my point. Yeah. So you have to make up your own mind where you fall. There's not a clear answer or consensus view. Well, there's definitely not a consensus view. I think in the profession there is a leaning one way or another, but make up your own minds. So here's the third one. Like, suppose that there is something more justicey, right, about when the rights are enforced in the way that Kant talks about. A way that doesn't depend on your private judgment. Further question, does that, like this type of central or impartial or public enforcement, this more justicey, does that require a state? Was it you? You said like, you can have this version of. It seems that you can have a version of this in a state of nature, right? Was it you, Tyler? I forget. Someone on the right side of the room. You might think, right, that all we need to have for the debate between us, I think you've wronged me, I don't think I've wronged you. If there is something wrong, and I can kind of get the intuition going about ultimately just settling that by force, by whoever gets to impose his view on the other, we just go to a third party, right? Someone we trust to say, okay, well, both of us, do we agree? We'll ask Terry about who's right, and then we'll go to ask Terry, and then, okay, well, it's his unilateral will, I guess, but it's neither of ours, right? We're no longer asserting authority over each other. So maybe that is more justicey. That would be a better way, a righter way of settling our conflict. But Terry is not a state by that, right? Not by Locke's account, but not by Kant's account. So I'm not sure. Right?
I think that example you just gave kind of appeals to the idea that there is like this idea of justice that we're appealing to, rather than it just being like your will or he agrees that it's your will that you're enforcing on somebody else. It's the idea that there's actual like objective right and wrong matter, and it has nothing to do with the necessity of will. It's just the actual appeal to reasoning.
Right. But here's the thing: Kant has to agree with that, right? Because Kant thinks it's all. Yeah. Well, yeah, but that's the puzzling part.
I'm agreeing with saying that's kind of like it seems to be suspicious that you need to have a state.
No, I got what you were saying. I'm just saying that I think this is why I think this is a worry for the project that Kant is doing, because he ought to be on board with this. It seems to me, right? But he's not. So, yeah.
So if you do get that third party to, I guess, be a judge in that case, even though it's not the state, and one of the parties decides that they don't like the opinion of that third party, are they committing injustice by not abiding by it? Or if they seek out a different judge who they think would be more favorable, is that another opportunity for justice to be done?
So let's say, like you and I have a dispute, right? I say, you ought to return that book to me right now. You said, no, you gave it to me, right? It's mine. Right? So like we have a dispute over who owns the book. I'm right, right? So, okay, we can't settle this. Let's ask Terry, right? And so your worry is, well, so Terry says, actually, it's Cameron's book. And now I go and I say, oh, I don't like that one. Right? Let's find someone else, right? Yeah.
Then is justice really served the first time, or are you allowed to seek justice again? And what makes it justice if that arbitrator does not align with what you think justice is?
Yeah, so difficult question, right? It might depend on...
State of nature.
Right. So here's a Lockean answer, right? So this is a version of running the Lockean intuition against Kant. I think what the Lockean answer would be is like, as long as we agreed to abide by Terry's judgment, I can't go and seek someone else then after that. The case is settled.
So if
Now,
you-
probably that is within limits, right? So like all consent for Locke is limited consent. So if Terry said, let me just read my tea leaves right here, it's Cameron's, then probably I could say, well, actually, that wasn't the point, right? Like, if he goes and has some type of investigation, he asks us what happened, maybe there's a witness or two or something, right? And then he comes up with it. Then he's within the limits of what a good arbitrator does. And then if I don't like it, well, then I ought to just suck it up. Even if it turns out that with the reasonable or rational principles of right, he really ought to have said that it was mine, right? So, but otherwise you can't have an arbitrator. And the Lockean would say by subjecting yourself to the judge, you consent to going with his will, given that the will remains within the boundaries of sort of not negligent activity.
So even under the Lockean instruction, whether you tacitly agree to abide by the arbitrator or not, or whether you explicitly agree by the action of you going there, you're expressing your consent to abide by whatever judgment this third party makes.
Yeah, if there is such a thing as tacitly consenting to be under an arbitrator, yeah, we'd have to hear what that would be. But yeah, sure. We've seen a little while back when we talked about Locke, how he has arguments about like how you can see the limits of consent by thinking about what the rationale or the reasoning was for giving your consent, right? So the reason for giving your consent to the state is to leave the problems of the state of nature behind, and so that puts some limits on what the government can do, which are sort of related to solving the problems of the state of nature. It can't just do anything.
Can't
Right?
mimic the state of nature.
Right, can't start taking your property,
Right.
right? So very clearly, because that's the whole problem we started with. Right? And it can't start killing you, right? And it can't enslave you and things like that. So, it can't be an absolute government either, because that's more dangerous than the state of nature. Right? So, all right. Anyone else? I forget your name. I'm sorry.
My name's
Nick?
Nick. Nick, yeah. I'm having trouble with, it just seems like there's a little bit of a jump between there being no justice in the state of nature, but there's justice in the state. Because isn't it like presupposing that they're already agreeing on some sort of justice to get there?
To get where?
Like with their,
Who's agreeing to?
like all the people in their omnilateral will, like they're all agreeing on some sort of justice to be, and then have an arbiter to give out that justice.
Chicken and the egg problem.
Yeah, like that's kind of my
Right.
point. Like,
Yeah, well, that might be. I think here's what Kant's answer is going to be, right? You can judge whether it's a good or a bad answer. I think what Kant's answer is going to be is saying there's two issues here. One is just like, is justice one thing or another? Like, does justice require that we don't steal each other's stuff, don't beat each other up, et cetera, right? Or does it require something else? Right? And we can get much more fine-grained. Right? Does it allow things like eminent domain rules or something? Right? We can have property, but with some limits, and so it's very complicated. Okay. That's debates about the content of justice. Right? That's one debate. Then the other debate is about the possibility of justice, whatever the content might be. Right? And he says the problem of the state of nature is got nothing to do with the content of justice, because we could all agree upon it if we're lucky. Right? But that still wouldn't be enough, because we can all see that whatever that thing is, right, it's not possible when we live without a state. And so that's just kind of, it's a kind of transcendental argument.
Without
But
a state, there's no essentially power to give out that justice.
yeah. So the conditions for justice don't exist. And that's all the only thing we need to realize. And he thinks pure reason will tell you that, as we've seen. So now, maybe you don't get it, right? Well, too bad, we can force you, right? And that's okay, because it's not really that bad to be forced to be living in accordance with pure reason, because you're committed to it inside your head anyway. So, not really forcing you to do anything that you don't rationally will or want anyway. We'll get to that in a second. So, did that help?
Yeah.
All right. So, to get to that, we just talked about it. So we've seen this, right? We're going to work towards why Kant thinks we can force people into the state. Here's basically the steps, right? He thinks the state's role is to maintain right or to create right, maybe, or guarantee right. Right allows the enforcement of everyone's external freedom, the right to choose, exercise your own will under a universal law in accordance with the same right for others. Right? In a state of nature, people lack that right, and so the state of nature is unjust in the highest degree, right? Probably he means in the highest degree because it's not even possible to get real injustice going, right? Devoid of justice is another phrase he uses. It just doesn't obtain. And life under civil government establishes these rights and therefore justice. And then, by magical trick, we will be able to somehow, it means that we morally must enter the state. It's not something we choose to avoid this going. And so, if we have that, then we can complete the argument for forcing people into the state. Notice again that there's something funky going on, right? So morally we must enter the state, yet at the same time, when we're not in the state, there is no real justice there, right? So there is that's this transcendental type of argument, right? That even by recognizing that justice isn't possible between us, and by recognizing that we ought to be committed to justice, we can see that there is some sort of derivative, meta, or higher level moral requirement that we get from unjust in the highest degree, right, where justice isn't even possible, to where justice actually is possible and in place. And so that's the sort of moral requirement or rational requirement. Ian?
So is he saying that justice arises from us, from our united wills or whatever, but there's a higher standard of justice outside while we should seek to create justice? I'm trying to formulate this.
So I think there's two issues going on here. So you're right, it's a good question. On the one hand, the ideas of justice are all derivable from pure reason, right? So it's in that sense it comes from us. It's not that we make it up, it's sort of ingrained into what our rational nature is like, right? We don't have a choice but to live along in accordance with our reason, and then reason requires justice. But for justice to apply between people who all are in that position, something more is needed than just that the actions happen to line up with reason. Right? Because we all have that reason, and we probably end up having different points of view about it, right? Because we have reason. The reason produces this kind of disagreement. And so then the question is, okay, well, if we have these different points of view about what reason really requires, we need to have something between us that settles it, right? And then, so there's this two-stage thing. In one sense, it comes from inside of our heads, but in the other hand, like when we have several heads side by side, between them, something else has to happen. Right? And that's the thing we're questioning or wrestling with here a little. How does that? Why is it not good enough if we just live in accordance with these rules, right? If they're there.
So it's reasonable and rational to give up your power to decide what's right or wrong for you, to subject yourself to a united power that would decide.
For all of us.
For all of us,
right.
Right.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Perfect. Kant would love you very much right now. Yeah. No, you're right. Exactly. And it is reasonable for us because we see that between us as reasonable creatures, we can't all just insist on our own point of view. Right? We have to have something that's outside of us or impartial or above all of us equally in order for reason to be respected. Right? Or everyone's reason, right? Not just abstract, but everyone's reason. Dominic? No.
So if the state's morally mandatory, you could say that you have no obligation to the state to a certain extent?
To create it.
Okay.
Well, you also have moral obligations to the state once it's there, right?
Yeah, but my question is if we are in an atmosphere that's devoid of justice, how does the moral obligation arise out of a scenario where there's no justice to begin with? It seems that part of justice is to have obligations.
Right.
That stem from morality. But he says clearly that we are in an atmosphere that's devoid of justice, so it doesn't seem like this pulls rabbit out of the hat. Because we got.
Right. So yeah, that's that two-stage thing that we were talking about, right? So yeah, this is this is generally sort of what how transcendental arguments work, right? It's like you realize that the necessary preconditions for justice aren't in place, and you realize that you have a commitment to acting in accordance with justice, and that somehow tells you see reasonably that means that you ought to create the conditions for justice to be there in the first place. Now, that requirement cannot itself be internal to justice, because we're exactly talking about a requirement that the preconditions for justice be in place, right? So that's the thing that you're talking about. Are we on one page? No?
Yeah, I mean, I can get where you're going with there. I don't see how you can admittedly have a scenario where you're doing justice. I mean, I understand where you're trying to go with it, but I don't see how you can have more obligation in a scenario like that personally.
So here's an analogy that Ripstein draws, which is an argument from the Critique of Practical Reason, I believe, that Kant gives. Anyway, it's a similar type of thinking. Let's say that we have an argument like this. Sorry for the crappy ink here, but so if A then B, right? Actually, I don't have to write the if. I could just do it like this. A, therefore B, right? So a conditional, the antecedent is true, therefore the consequent is true, right? This is a valid form of reasoning. We can all see this. Right? If you go out in the rain, then you'll get wet, right? You're going out in the rain, you'll get wet. So, now Kant says, not with quite the gusto that Lewis Carroll later put it, but here's the version. Is this a valid form of reason? Like how? Like can we really infer B from if A then B and A? Well, yes, but not because of something we've written down, right? We could only do it if we wrote down here, so actually 3 wouldn't be the conclusion, we'd have to put that in 4. So if is this thing not working? See this one. There you go. If A then B, wait, and A then B, right? Something that tells us that if we have this and we have this, then we're allowed to conclude now for right, B, right? Something that tells us that if we have these two steps in place, then we can actually move to the conclusion that B is true. Like that's really completed. But of course, now we can ask the following question, right? Like, okay, we have A and B. If A then B, we have A, and we have if A then B, and A then B. But does that follow? No, because we need another one that says if A and B, right? And we can go on and on and on and on forever, right? Now, what's Kant's point? Kant's point is reasoning, like at some point we have to accept that to make an inference from this to this, we can't want to spell out all the parts that we need to make the inference, because what are we going to use to make that further inference? We're going to use reason. Right? So the fact that this is an inference, that's just something in our mind that can't be part of the argument, because we have to, the argument is the tool that we're using when we use our reason. Or reason is the tool that we use when we make this technical argument. You can't put the tool itself on, right, when that's the thing we're using to interpret this, so you can't write that out. Now, that means, right, is for you to be able to reason, right, you have to assume, you have to buy into, if you will, into sort of a game that certain inferences can't, even though you can't prove them or like write them out, that they go through, right? And so maybe, by analogy, it's not exactly the same, but for you to have justice, be possible, some things have to be true. But it's not justice itself that can require those things to be true, because that would be like continuing to add things to the argument. But it cannot be part of the argument, because we have to get into the game first. Right? And so the requirement to get into the game, that's what we're talking about. That's the unjust in the highest degree talk, I think. And that's what Ripstein suggests. So, Ian, did you?
So it's something, okay, so it's something higher than justice that requires justice?
Well, it's not. It's still justice, right? But it's the idea of justice itself has, like, it appeals to us, right? Or more strictly, it has some sort of requiring attraction to us, right? So we see we ought to live under justice. We also see that if we're in a state of nature, we cannot live under justice, and that, like, so okay, we're required to live under justice. We know that right now, we cannot live under justice, but in the state we can. That gives us a requirement. Like, the requirement to live under justice is a requirement to move from impossible to possible. Right? Now, philosophically speaking, of course, what type of requirement is that to move from impossible to possible? It cannot be itself a requirement of justice, because we're in a situation where justice is impossible, so it couldn't be a requirement of, right? But that's like saying, like, we have to spell everything in the argument out, right? And that means we keep going forever, because when I put down if A and B, right? Then we ask the same question again. So now we need if, and so up until the point where there's infinite ifs, right? And then some more. And that seems to be the same reasoning here, right? Like, so there is justice is out there, and we know we have to live under it. We also know that right now it's impossible to live under it, and that tells us that we ought to move towards it. Now, when we do not move towards it, we're doing something wrong. Not wrong in the simple sense of unjust, because it's not possible here, but it still violates the idea of justice. Right? And so that's why you get this back and forth all the time, where he seems to say, on the one hand, you have no rights. On the other hand, you have rights, but they're provisional. Right? On the one hand, there is no justice in the state of nature. In the other hand, it's unjust in the highest degree, right? And so on. So, Cameron?
Okay,
I forgot you.
Yeah, it's all right. So, and I know this is somewhat related to Kyle, but
Good.
It's more so related to Locke. So Locke's biggest, at least when I was reading his argument, his biggest shaky part was the tacit consent thing. To justify the state.
Mm-hmm.
How could you justify the state using Locke's argument without the tacit consent?
Oh, okay. Well, you might come up with some other argument, right? That's as good as giving your consent. So people have tried to do that. We talked a couple of weeks back about some people think that if you have, like, certain things are like public goods that are non-excludable. If a bunch of you work together to produce a public good, keep the air clean, for example, then I'm going to benefit from this whether or not I contribute or not. And then if I don't contribute, that's unfair. And then maybe you can force me to contribute. If you believe that, then you believe in something, a rough version of the so-called fair play principle. And some people think that the fair play principle applies to the state in general, because the state is doing all those things. So that's one. Very few, but some people have tried to run arguments from gratitude. So Socrates in the Crito, for example, runs an argument from. He gives a bunch of arguments, but one argument why he thinks he ought to drink the hemlock when he's condemned to death. So his Crito comes in and says, "Let's escape. You're innocent." He says, "Yeah, I'm innocent, but I should still obey the law." Why? One thing he says is, "I owe so much to Athens and its laws that out of gratitude, I'm obligated to obey, even when they kill me." Terry can tell you much more about this than I can. But he's the author of the best book I know on gratitude. So. Maybe, but yeah, like my son is my favorite child. So, that's one argument. Another argument, Rawls, who we'll be looking at on next week, he has an argument that he tried to construe about a natural duty of justice. So similar to Kant, but he thinks duties are possible outside the state, but for justice between us to obtain, we need certain institutions to be in place. for it fully to be obtained, and so we have a natural duty of justice to create these institutions under which we can fully be in justice with one another.
So there's a natural justice, but there's a greater justice by creating institutions?
Yeah, so there are certain natural duties that we have before we create the institutions, and then once we have those, a full set of duties, and justice comes into place. So those are more or less your, some people think democracy, sort of voting in a democracy or participating in a democracy is as good as consent. Those are sort of your, I guess these are your usual suspects. Now, most people who believe that the Lockean story of tacit consent doesn't work think so because they think that to become obligated to something as big as obeying the government, you have to give a pretty strong argument for why you've satisfied freely or voluntarily the conditions to become obligated to such a big thing. Right? And if you believe that, all these other arguments get really problematic really quickly. So the same type of worries start in different forms, but they start popping up usually. Now, not everyone thinks so. There are people who defend these arguments, but most people who take the Lockean, who take skepticism about Locke's tacit consent doctrine very seriously are also skeptical about those other arguments. So this is by no means a necessary truth, but it's, I guess, sort of to describe the discipline. Lots of people who see themselves as broadly speaking Lockeans think that the answer is like, how do you justify the state? The answer is you don't. Doesn't mean that everything the state does is unjust, like when they arrest criminals and so on, that's great, let's keep doing. But generally speaking, you kind of get to pick and choose, morally. If you don't want to go to prison, pay all your taxes, but morally speaking, if you could get away with it, you should pay the part that's necessary to apprehend the criminals, right, and so on. And you can add the list to your taste, but not just blanket because the state says so.
Basically, the law does not justify law or justify morality. Morality is
Right.
higher than the law.
Yeah, and yeah, that seems to be the, I think that's the dominant view. Do you agree with that, Terry? Am I not lampooning the field?
Yeah. It's my view, so it must be different.
Therefore the best, right?
There's a danger, yeah.
Right. Well, it's my view too. So.
Sociological question, I'm not a sociologist.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to reflect what the state of the debate is. I think that most people hold that view.
Yeah.
It's a funky thing going on in that when you look at the literature, there's sort of like a selection effect, right? Like, so lots of people who hold the views that Terry holds think, well, okay, so we've had a bunch of authors who've shown these things and we've been convinced. And so they're kind of generally convinced, so they're not in the business, they're right about other stuff because they don't think that you're going to have a good argument for why you obey the law. So the people who are in the debate are the ones who are the exceptions to the general, who think, I have a good argument, right? And they write. So if you look at the literature, there's all sorts of arguments for why you should obey the law, except most people think that all these arguments fail, right? And that's why they're not in the debate. So there's a weird selection effect there going on. Yeah, so there's maybe a tacit majority of non-believers in tacit consent.
It's almost like an audition or a tryout and say, oh, I got such a good argument. Not necessarily because they necessarily buy it, but they can show how you can flex like their argument skills to show how you can have them.
Yeah, okay, yeah, although I think that might be it, but also part of it is I think that there are, I mean, many philosophers are sort of, I don't know, this may be too strong, but I'll talk like maybe sort of glib about these type of things. Anyway, I'll hold these anarchist views won't really change the world. Right? But then there's a bunch of people who really worry about this, right? Who really do think that this is dangerous, or who really do take the idea of sort of a community in which, as a nation or something, take that very seriously. And so they're strongly committed to trying to explain why they have that intuition that we're really all into like really all into this thing together or something, or we govern ourselves under rules through the state or through the law or something, right? And when the law says one thing, it's really an expression of how we decide as a nation to live together. My dad loves talking like that. It drives me crazy, but you know, lots of people like talking like that, and they think that's a very plausible. So if you want to make sense of that instead of people like me started thinking that way like 20 years ago, and then read these arguments and said, oh, I guess I have to change my mind. So other people think, well, okay, these are cute arguments, but there's still this intuition that we're failing to express properly, and so they see their task as trying to get the intuition defended as best as possible. So it's not sort of just exercising your muscles, right? It's not weightlifting. They think there's a real thing to be defended that's neglected. They're wrong, but anyway. Yeah. All right. We're not going to make it all the way through, but that's fine. So here's a version of the argument that we get about why these points, state of nature is without justice, civil society has justice, why that leads to we can actually force people into the state. Let me write it out before I go through these steps. If you had to guess, if you had to tell me why does Kant think that? Why can we force people into the state because of these points? What would you say? So state of nature, unjust in the highest degree because justice isn't even possible. Civil society or the state, justice is necessarily there, right? Not just possible, it's just there, guaranteed, because omnilateral will with enforcement behind it. It's exactly what we're looking for. And so we can force people from one to the other. Why? Tell me.
Well, it says that the state unites the people under PHI laws, and it says that it's necessary and a condition in which what belongs to each person can be secured against and from everyone else. So I think he's saying that that's the only way. If you reason that's the only way that you can actually live.
Yeah, good. So but that's one thing to say that I can only really reasonably live under these laws. It's another thing to say that you can, force me to do that. Okay, Tyler? No.
Might be that. I mean, if you don't force them, then you can't establish right. And so it'd be preferable to do that than just say, okay, I won't force you.
Yeah, okay, but not everything that's sort of better, morally speaking, can be forced, right? Can be enforced. So Kant famously thinks you have so-called imperfect duties, like you ought to give, you have a duty to give to charity, but not every charity all the time, so we can't really force you. You get to choose which one and when, but you're required to give. It's just not enforceable, right? Or he thinks you have a duty to develop your talents, for example. You owe it to yourself to make the best out of you that you can, but that's not enforceable. You have an idea, Cameron?
Maybe he thinks that the state of nature is so bad that you have a duty to make sure that people can be so much better off. But even if they're taking in, kicking and screaming, they're made so much better by participating in civil society that you have an obligation to do so when you can.
Good. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, do you mean like sort of like it's for their own good to be thrown into civil society?
Yeah,
kicking and
because
screaming?
it's not really rational according to Kant, to not be in a civil society.
Yes,
And
for
these
sure.
people are being irrational. So, help them get to a place where they can be rational among other rationally minded people who are in this rational civil society.
Right. Yeah, well, the main points are definitely agreeable to Kant. He does think these people are being irrational, and he does think that's rational to want to be in the society, or to have the maxim that you be in the society. One is not the best term for Kant. But at the same time, here elsewhere, he has an essay called on the common saying that may be true in theory but not in does not apply in practice. He's very strongly anti-paternalist. You're never justified in forcing someone to do something for their own good. And you can remember, right, we started with all this stuff was based on external freedom being the equal right of people to choose, and we don't look at what's going on inside our heads, right? So we're almost there, but it can't be quite that it's good for their own good, because Kant is very clear that no, that's not a good reason. Nick?
Is it because we need omnilateral will, so therefore if we're morally obligated to enter into the state, then we would need everyone to also, so there's like almost a moral obligation to make sure everybody else also is.
Oh, that's interesting, because it wouldn't be an omnilateral will otherwise. Is that the idea?
You're morally obligated to the state, so therefore you're also morally obligated to make sure everybody else
Huh.
getting into it as well.
Yeah, I don't think that's what Kant says, but it's an interesting idea. It might be a good Kantian argument to. Might be a good paper idea. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but it's a very. No, so Kant. It's in some ways it's more straightforward argument, right? Like, why can we force people into this state? Well, because the state is the only condition where right is possible, and remember, right itself has the permission to use force built into it. Right? So, right is enforceable. So he can. Now, remember, right? Like this, he's doing the same. We have the same two-level trick thing going on, right? Like, right is enforceable as a matter of justice. So, like, we saw that as like when somebody is wronging you, you get to use force to protect your rights against them. Now we're talking about something different, right? Not just like you're doing something wrong, but it's wrong in the highest degree because it's not yet possible. And so for that too, then apparently force is allowed. Right. So, right, we'll run through it, and then this will be we'll end there. So, state of nature, justice and right are impossible. We've seen this, right? It's true that the state of nature need not, just because it's natural, be a state of injustice, right? So he says, hey, look, it could be that we all respect each other's rights perfectly. We're the nicest people on earth. Right? But it would still be a state devoid of justice, in which rights are in dispute. It's the different points of view idea. Justice is not where rights are in dispute. Justice is where rights are settled and clear. There would be no judge competent to render a verdict having rightful force. That's the problem, right? We all have our individual wills, all our own point of view, and not a single judge competent to render the authoritative, forceful answer. So, justice is not possible in the state of nature. Now, to want to maintain such a condition would be to renounce any concepts of right. That's a phrase that he uses in 44. He says, unless you want to renounce all concepts of right, you can't want to be living in that condition. Now, he thinks, right, that's the stuff we talked about, right? The concept of right, if you accept that you would want to live under a situation where the conditions of right are not met, is to renounce the very concept of right. You don't get, like, you're distancing yourself from that idea. But rationally, right, as you were pointing out, Cameron, that you can't do that, right? Because right is itself a requirement of rationality. So it's impossible for rational people to renounce any concept of rights. So therefore, it's impossible for rational people to want to stay in the state of nature. Right? You can want it, but you're just not being rational. Right? Here's a way of putting it in Kant's terms. The first thing each party, he means, has to resolve upon. So the first thing, right? Like before we can get to justice, first we have to resolve is the principle that the party, that we, you and me, right, must leave the state of nature, in which each follows his own judgment. Unite him or itself with all others, with which it cannot avoid interacting. Right? Now, of course, if we never came across each other, this whole idea of different points of view wouldn't cause any issues, because we'd never have the disagreement. But if we do come across each other, we need to unite ourselves into this omnilateral will. Subject to the public lawful external coercion, and so enter into a condition in which what is to be recognized as belonging to it, to you or me, is determined by law. By law. He loves that. Right? And is allotted to it by adequate power. Not your own, but an external power. And it's above all else to enter a civil condition. It's even better when you put these things in German, like by law, Recht. I like that. Here's another one. So, from private right in a state of nature, therefore proceeds a postulate of public right. Now, a postulate of public right, it just means that there's like a rational requirement, like we have this extra rational requirement to live under conditions of right. We can see that if right is not possible, there is some sort of practical requirement on it. That's just his postulate. This can't talk for that. Right? And this postulate of public right is like, when you cannot avoid living side by side with all others, you ought to live in the state of nature and protect and proceed with them into a rightful condition. So if you were just like Robinson Crusoe, right? Like by himself on an island, doesn't have to establish a government because it's just him. Man Friday shows up, state of nature. And then they have to join into some, omnilateral will is pretty easy between them, right? But they can't avoid coming into contact with each other, so they're going to have disagreements potentially, even if they never appear. So you set up this system for equitably, fairly settling any disputes that might show up. Right. Now here's the point we just talked about, right? All rights are coercively enforceable with justice, or just coercively enforced with justice, at least in a civil condition. Oh, so I don't know why that happened, but anyway. Here are two quotes by him, right? So that's part of the hindrance to hindrance argument, but he also first says it when the appropriation stuff comes on. He says it has this corollary. Must be possible in terms of right to have an external object as your own, then you must also be permitted to constrain everyone else with it. To enter along with him into a civil condition. Right? Says that follows from the... So he presents that, right? The very first time when he starts saying appropriation means you establish a right, right means you can enforce it. By the way, corollary, right? Like he was already announcing it, that also means the same requirement is also a requirement to draw people into the state of nature where these rights are settled by a postulate. I don't know why. Kant seems to think that if you call something a postulate, that makes it more precise. But that's actually, that counts as an explanation. But tip for your paper, if you don't have an argument, call it a postulate. All right. Here, the civil or the rightful condition guarantees that right is achieved by binding all of our wills together and so on. And so hence, each may impel the other by force to leave the state, entering a rightful condition. You are authorized to use coercion, someone who by his nature threatens you with coercion. By his nature, right? Not actually, but by your nature, as in by being not under government. Blah, 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 blah. All right, we got a couple more minutes. Any questions lingering about this? Yeah, Tyler.
I mean, it seems like if you accept the initial premise of reason bestowing all these intuitions on us, then it like kind of pulls itself up by its bootstraps in a way. I mean, not to say it's circular, but like,
right. No, I think you're right to have that feel that there is some sort of bootstrapping going on. That's generally what these transcendental arguments are about, right? And this point here was supposed to show, or Kant thinks that shows that ultimately that's how reason has to work, right? Like we always have to go from what we can spell out explicitly to seeing that everything that we spell out explicitly cannot be all there is to say. There has to be something else to be said, which we can only access or see has to exist by seeing that we can't spell out everything. Right? And so part of his argument against the empiricist, right? Like, so the empiricist says everything we know about the world is what we see. Kant says, well, you need something to interpret what you see. Right? And so it cannot be that everything that you see just is all there. There has to be something. Now, how do we don't see that, right? But we couldn't. Right? Just like you can't see the rule of inference in the actual inference. It's a rule of inference, so it's out, right? And so just like the postulate itself cannot be a requirement of justice, it's the thing that gets you to justice, right? Yeah, but you're right. So that seems like it is this type of sort of moving back towards a truth that's not, that you can't literally put your finger on. Right? So. All right, we were supposed to talk about something else today. What I might do, because we have online students, I'll probably have to record a lecture without you guys here for that. So I'll put that on Canvas so you can stream me. How about that for the 21st century? All right, well, that was it. Let me know if you have any questions that come up about the other lecture. I'll try to record that tomorrow. Hope to see you at 5. Hope that Kant didn't knock the philosophical life out of you. See you later.
Are you familiar with the positional statements there?
With what, sir?